You really think a call sign like JUICEBOX means anything, old man? Captain Mark Reynolds' voice sliced through the air, dripping with disdain as he stood tall in front of the elderly man. The young Marine's eyes gleamed with mockery, his comrades chuckling in the background. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to undermine the old veteran, but this time, it felt different. The old man, sitting quietly in his worn-out military jacket, didn't flinch. His eyes were calm, distant, as if his mind was far removed from the petty insults being thrown his way. Captain Reynolds took a step forward, a smirk playing on his lips as he crossed his arms. You can't even remember the last time you wore that uniform, can you? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. I guess they give out call signs to anyone these days, huh? JUICEBOX, what's next, Grandpa? The air around them felt charged, tense. The Marines stood around, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. The atmosphere thickened with the sound of mockery echoing in the background, but John Davis remained unmoved. At 87 years old, he had long learned the value of silence, especially in moments like these. He'd heard worse in his life, far worse. A young officer's words weren't going to shake him. Instead, he simply stared ahead, letting the ridicule wash over him. He wasn't the man he used to be, not physically. His hands were gnarled from years of wear, but his mind, sharp as ever, saw through the young Marine's bravado. He wasn't just any old man. He wasn't just anyone with a call sign. JUICEBOX, as the young Marine mocked it, wasn't a joke. It was earned in a way few could ever imagine. What's that supposed to mean, Grandpa? Reynolds continued, the crowd now shifting uncomfortably. Did you get that call sign because you served in some godforsaken place? Or because you still think you're one of us? The older man shifted in his seat, his weathered face finally showing a flicker of life. Slowly, he pulled out a small, worn pin from his pocket, the emblem barely visible under the years of wear. This, he said softly, his voice carrying more weight than any word had in years. This is my call sign. This is what it means. The room fell silent. Captain. Reynolds' smirk wavered for a moment as he stared at the pin, his mouth slightly agape. The old man's calm demeanor had thrown him off. JUICEBOX wasn't just some nickname. It was a legacy, a reminder of the countless lives John Davis had touched, the battles he had fought, the friendships he had formed, and the missions he had survived. A legacy that could never be mocked, no matter how much Reynolds tried. As the silence hung in the air, something shifted. A voice broke through the tension, a low whisper of recognition. Wait, a young airman muttered, his voice filled with awe. Isn't that? Before he could finish, another voice, this time more authoritative, cut in. Yeah, said Staff Sergeant Samuel Henson, his tone shifting from skepticism to reverence. That's JUICEBOX. A few seconds passed, but it felt like an eternity. Reynolds took a step back, his arrogant stance faltering. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered, realizing the weight of what had just been revealed. The old man wasn't just some forgotten relic of the past. His call sign was a piece of history, a name whispered in the halls of military legend. And in that moment, the reality of the situation hit him. Captain Reynolds looked around, but no one was laughing anymore. There were no smirks, no mocking glances. Just a room full of men who suddenly realized they had been standing in the presence of someone far greater than they could ever hope to be. The silence in the room was thick. Captain Reynolds stood frozen, staring at the worn pin in the old man's hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a piece of history, a piece of a life lived in the shadows of wars and memories that no one could ever truly understand. The mocking smirk on Reynolds' face slowly faded, replaced by a dawning realization of who he was actually speaking to. The words that followed were laced with disbelief. You can't be serious. John Davis didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the young captain with eyes that had seen more than any person should in a lifetime. His gaze was calm, almost as if the moment was beneath him. He had no need to prove anything anymore. He had seen the worst, and he had survived it, time and time again. Reynolds felt a sudden, uncomfortable heat in his chest, a sharp sting of embarrassment he hadn't anticipated. What did you say your call sign was again? He asked, his voice faltering. John didn't need to repeat it. The room was already beginning to stir with whispers. Some of the other Marines had recognized it. Some had heard the stories. But none of them, Not even the most seasoned officers had ever expected to meet the man behind the legend. As the murmur spread, Staff Sergeant Henson, who had been quietly observing, finally stepped forward. Your JUICEBOX." The words were barely audible, but they cut through the tension like a hot knife. John gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving Reynolds, as if to silently challenge him. "That's me," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. The room seemed to hold its breath as Reynolds slowly looked around, his mind racing to process the revelation. "You're not just some old man," he whispered under his breath. He couldn't finish the sentence. It wasn't possible. John Davis had been the stuff of stories. The kind of stories passed down in hushed tones between soldiers, of a man who had saved lives, who had defied the odds, who had earned his place among the greatest. "It's not about the call sign, Captain," John said quietly, breaking the spell. "It's about the lives it represents." The words hung in the air, heavier than any weapon in the room. Reynolds looked down, the weight of his own arrogance crashing down on him. He had thought he was the one in control, the one who could mock the old man. But now, he understood that the real power didn't come from rank or uniforms or flashy titles. It came from the experiences, the sacrifices, the quiet dignity that only someone who had truly earned their place could carry. The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful. Slowly, General Hayes, who had been quietly standing at the back of the room, stepped forward. His face was stoic, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his respect. "Captain Reynolds," he said, his voice commanding but calm, "you've just had a lesson in humility, and it's one you won't forget." He turned to John Davis, his expression softening. "Sir, it's an honor to have you here. We've been waiting a long time to meet you." The Marines in the room stood at attention, their respect palpable. Even Reynolds, who had moments ago been ready to laugh off the old veteran, now stood taller, understanding the gravity of the man in front of him. John Davis nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the respect he had just earned, not through words, but through the history that spoke louder than any rank or call sign ever could. As the silence lingered in the room, Captain Reynolds stood, his mind racing. He had no words left, just a lingering realization that he had just mocked someone who was far greater than he could ever imagine. General Hayes, standing at the back of the room, took a step forward, his presence commanding. "Captain, that's enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "We don't mock heroes in this room." His gaze shifted to John Davis, who remained seated, still as calm as ever. There was no need for bravado, no need for words. His presence spoke volumes. "Sir," General Hayes said, his voice now filled with respect, "it is an honor to meet you. The legacy you've built is beyond words." The general's words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades of military history. Reynolds could only stand there, processing the shift that had just occurred. He had gone from being the one in control, the one who held power, to someone who had to reckon with the power of experience and history. "You don't understand, do you?" A voice suddenly cut through the air. It was Staff Sergeant Henson, who had been standing quietly off to the side, observing the whole exchange. "That call sign isn't just a name, it's a story. A story of someone who saved lives, fought when no one else would, and never backed down." He stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "You might think you know what it means to serve, but you haven't seen what this man has seen. His call sign wasn't handed to him. It was earned, over and over again." Henson's words were a quiet but powerful declaration of respect, and the Marines who had been standing around, still in shock, now found themselves nodding in agreement. The weight of the moment was sinking in, and it was clear that none of them would ever look at John Davis the same way again. General Hayes turned his attention back to Davis, his face softened with admiration. "I remember hearing your name in stories, but I never imagined I would get the privilege of meeting you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You were the standard by which many of us measured ourselves. And now, I stand here in awe of you." John Davis simply nodded, his eyes focused on the general. There was no need for grand speeches or dramatic gestures. The respect was mutual, unspoken, and profound. The room was still. The Marines, once full of youthful arrogance, now stood in reverence. Captain Reynolds, still processing, finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. I didn't know, he muttered, the words slipping out almost as an apology. I had no idea who you really were. John Davis looked up at him then, his expression unchanged. It's not about me, he said quietly. It's about the men I served with. The ones who never made it back. They're the ones who deserve the recognition. I'm just the one who's still here to tell their story. The room seemed to hold its breath as Reynolds absorbed the gravity of Davis's words. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly serve. It wasn't about the rank or the call sign. It was about sacrifice, humility, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. You're right, Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. General Hayes gave a slight nod, acknowledging the shift. We all have our lessons to learn, Captain, he said. But today, you learned something important. The weight of those words settled in the room, and for the first time, it felt like the right kind of silence. A silence filled with respect, understanding, and the acknowledgement of a legacy that would never be forgotten. The room had fallen into an eerie quiet, but it was not the uncomfortable silence that had filled the air before. This time, the atmosphere was different, charged with respect and understanding. Captain Reynolds stood at attention, still processing the gravity of the situation. His youthful arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the weight of what he had just learned. The realization that John Davis, the man he had mocked, wasn't just any old soldier. He was a living legend, a man who had earned his call sign through unimaginable sacrifice. General Hayes, who had been standing at the back of the room watching the interaction unfold, stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of every Marine in the room. Captain Reynolds, the general said, his voice firm yet gentle. There are moments in this life that define who we are, and this is one of those moments. He looked at John Davis, his gaze filled with admiration. And I'll tell you this, Captain, General Hayes continued, his voice carrying weight. You've just witnessed the very essence of what it means to be a soldier. It's not about rank or insignia. It's about the legacy you leave behind, the respect you earn, and the people whose lives you touch. Captain Reynolds swallowed hard, his chest tightening with emotion. He had always been taught that respect had to be earned through power and strength, that a soldier's worth was measured by the uniform they wore and the ranks they held. But now, standing before the man who had lived through more than any one person should, he understood that the true measure of a soldier was not the insignia on their chest, but the respect they commanded without ever asking for it. I had no idea, Captain Reynolds finally said, his voice quieter now, filled with genuine remorse. I never understood what it truly meant to serve until now. His words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the sincerity of someone who had been changed in an instant. John Davis, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice, though soft, was steady, carrying the weight of years spent serving alongside men who would never return. It's not about you, Captain, he said, his words slow but deliberate. It's about all those who didn't make it home. They're the ones who deserve the recognition, the ones who fought and died. I'm just here to keep their stories alive. His gaze was unwavering as he looked at Reynolds, who stood frozen, absorbing the magnitude of the message. The general, who had been watching the exchange with quiet approval, stepped forward and placed a hand on Captain Reynolds' shoulder. You've learned a valuable lesson today, son, he said, his tone softened with understanding. But there's one more thing you need to remember. It's not enough to just learn the lesson. You have to live by it. You have to carry that respect forward, not just for veterans, but for everyone who serves this country. Captain Reynolds nodded slowly, his mind still processing. He had been humbled, but more importantly, he had been awakened to something greater than himself, something that transcended uniforms and ranks. I will, he said, his voice steady now, full of conviction. I'll remember this. As the room stood in silence, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence of understanding, a silence of respect. And in that silence, John Davis, the man who had fought countless battles and saved countless lives, had taught them all the most important lesson of all, the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and respect. The weeks following that tense encounter were quiet, but the air in the barracks had changed. Captain Reynolds no longer walked with the same air of confidence that once bordered on arrogance. The respect he had earned through his rank now felt hollow in comparison to the true respect that came with experience, sacrifice, and humility. It was a quiet shift, one that most of the younger Marines didn't fully grasp, but the older officers noticed. And so did the veterans. John Davis, who had been mostly silent since that day, continued his routine, which involved cleaning the range, maintaining old equipment, and sharing stories with those who took the time to listen. His life wasn't about the fanfare. It never had been. He simply wanted to make sure that the lessons he had learned and the people he had fought beside were not forgotten. The respect he commanded wasn't born from titles or call signs. It came from the way he carried himself. It came from the way he moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who knew what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself. One afternoon, as Davis was walking across the tarmac, carrying a toolbox from the hangar, Captain Reynolds approached him. This time, there was no mockery, no insults, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Sir," Reynolds said, standing a few feet away, still unsure of the proper way to address the old veteran. Davis paused and looked up, his face unchanged from the calm demeanor he had always carried. "Captain," he said simply, giving a small nod. It was the first time Reynolds had called him that. There was no need for any more words. The simple recognition was enough. It wasn't about ranks. It wasn't about call signs. It was about understanding that some things in life were earned through actions, not words. The two men stood there for a moment, the weight of the past and present hanging between them. Finally, Reynolds spoke again, this time with more clarity, his voice steady. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, looking directly at Davis. "For everything you did. For everything you taught us." Davis didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the young captain, who had finally understood what it meant to earn respect the hard way. After a long pause, Davis spoke softly, his voice carrying more than the words themselves. "You're welcome. But remember this, Captain," he said, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "You don't get respect because of your rank. You earn it through your actions. And when you forget that, when you start thinking it's about the uniform or the title, that's when you lose it all." The lesson had been simple but profound. Captain Reynolds stood there for a moment, absorbing the truth in those words. For the first time, he understood the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about titles. It was about how you treated people, how you earned their respect, and how you made sure they knew they mattered. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As John Davis turned to walk away, Reynolds watched him go. The old veteran's back was straight, his steps purposeful, and for the first time, Captain Reynolds could see the strength that wasn't visible in the old man's worn face. It wasn't about physical strength. It was the strength that came from experience. It was the strength that came from living a life of integrity, from making the hard choices, and from never backing down. Reynolds stood there for a moment longer, thinking about the man who had just taught him more than any book or officer could. And as he turned to walk back to his unit, he knew that the lesson he had just learned would stay with him for the rest of his career. Months passed since the day Captain Reynolds had learned the value of respect. The barracks were quieter, and the Marines seemed to move with a different purpose, especially when it came to their interactions with the older veterans who had started showing up more often. The old men, once disregarded and forgotten, now had an air of quiet dignity about them. They walked through the halls like shadows of the past, yet their presence was undeniable. They were no longer invisible to the young soldiers, and they no longer felt the need to prove themselves. They had earned that right long ago. John Davis, though still a regular fixture at the base, didn't seek attention. He went about his day, fixing equipment, inspecting planes, and cleaning the range, just as he always had. Yet, now, his every move was observed with a new respect. Marines who once barely acknowledged him now stopped to shake his hand, to hear his stories, or simply to thank him for his service. It was a quiet revolution, one that didn't involve grand gestures, but rather small moments of recognition. One afternoon, as Davis was inspecting a helicopter, Captain Reynolds approached him. This time, there was no mockery, no sarcasm. There was only respect. "Sir," Reynolds said, standing off to the side, unsure of how to begin, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that day. About earning respect." Davis, who had been crouched beside the engine, didn't immediately look up. He was accustomed to the young man's presence by now, but this time felt different. When he spoke, his voice was calm, as always. "You don't have to say anything, Captain," Davis said, his hands still working with the engine. "I know what you're here for." Reynolds hesitated, then stepped closer. "No, it's not that. I wanted to thank you for showing me what real respect looks like. I get it now. It's not about rank or call signs or any of that." Davis looked up at him then, his eyes meeting Reynolds with the same intensity as before, but now there was a flicker of something else, understanding. "It's about how you treat people, Captain," Davis said, his voice low but firm. "It's about how you make them feel, how you see them. That's what earns respect. It's not something you can demand or force. It's something you give, and when you give it, it comes back to you." Reynolds nodded, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about the guys we serve with," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The ones who didn't make it home. The ones whose stories we never hear. They deserve more than just a moment of silence. They deserve to be remembered. And I think that's what you're teaching us. It's not just about honoring the past. It's about carrying it forward, making sure it never gets lost." Davis gave him a small nod, his gaze softening. "That's exactly right, Captain. It's about making sure their sacrifices mean something. It's about making sure they're never forgotten." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. The helicopter engine was still, and the sounds of the base had faded into the background. It was just the two of them, the old man and the young captain, standing side by side in the quiet of the hangar. Finally, Reynolds spoke again, his voice steady. "I want to make sure I do right by them. By you. By all of you." Davis looked up at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, with a small but genuine smile, he said, "You already are, Captain. You already are." The words weren't just a recognition of Reynolds' growth. They were a passing of the torch, a quiet acknowledgement that the young officer had finally earned his place, not just in rank, but in the history of the men who had come before him. The air in the hangar seemed to shift in that moment. The respect between them was no longer just a lesson, it was a bond. And it was one that would last long after the helicopters had flown, long after the Marines had left the base. It was the kind of respect that didn't need words. It was the kind that was built over time, earned through action, and remembered forever. It had been months since Captain Reynolds had learned the lesson that would change his approach to leadership and respect. He no longer carried the same brash confidence that had once defined him. The air around the barracks felt different too, softer, almost. Marines moved with a new understanding, one that wasn't just about rank or authority, but about what had been earned, what had been lived. One morning, as Reynolds walked through the mess hall, he noticed the change. The younger Marines, once quick to dismiss the veterans who often passed through, now greeted them with a nod or a handshake. They didn't need to be reminded anymore about the value of experience, of sacrifice. And it wasn't just in the mess hall. It showed in how they interacted in the field, in the training sessions, in the conversations between meals. They spoke with a level of respect that hadn't been there before, a recognition that the veterans, especially men like John Davis, had earned their place not by titles, but by the lives they had lived. Captain Reynolds, though, still had a long way to go. While the changes in the barracks were obvious, the internal shift within him was something deeper. He found himself more reflective, more aware of the nuances in the relationships he now shared with his team. He understood that leadership wasn't about authority or command. It was about listening, learning, and leading by example. It was about being a guide, not just a figurehead. One afternoon, while overseeing a routine training session, Reynolds caught a glimpse of Davis standing at the edge of the field, watching the younger Marines as they went through their drills. The old man was still a quiet presence, observing, but never intervening unless asked. There was something about his stillness that commanded attention. Reynolds walked over, as he often did now, without the arrogance that used to define their interactions. "You know," Reynolds began, his voice casual but thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how respect isn't given, but earned. I think I finally get it." Davis looked up, his eyes meeting Reynolds with that same knowing calm. "I think you do," Davis replied, his voice steady and sincere. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being real with people. They'll follow you if they believe you've got their backs." Reynolds nodded, taking in the simplicity of the words. It wasn't complicated, and yet it was the hardest lesson to learn. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, trying to climb the ranks, thinking that respect would follow the uniform. But now, Standing beside the man who had earned the right to be called a legend, Reynolds realized that the most powerful kind of respect wasn't about what you wore, but who you were when no one was watching. "Do you ever miss it?" Reynolds asked, gesturing toward the young Marines. "The action, the missions, all of it." Davis looked out at the field for a moment, his eyes distant, as if remembering something long buried. "I miss the camaraderie," he said quietly. "I miss knowing that the man beside you has your back, no matter what. But the missions, the action? No, not really. I've seen enough of that in my life. I'm just glad I made it out. Glad I'm still here to see the next generation rise up." The words hung in the air, a sobering reminder of the price that was paid for freedom, for security, for the peace that the younger Marines now trained for. Reynolds watched as Davis turned back toward the group, his figure a quiet, respected shadow on the edge of the training field. It wasn't until later that night, as he lay in his bunk reflecting on the day's conversation, that Reynolds truly understood the magnitude of what he had learned. Leadership, he realized, wasn't just about taking charge. It was about knowing when to step back, when to listen, and when to let those who have been there show you the way. And John Davis, in his quiet, unassuming way, had shown him exactly that. Captain Reynolds had learned the hardest lesson of all, how to truly lead, not by command, but by the example you set and the respect you give to those who came before you. It had been a few months since the shift in Captain Reynolds' understanding of respect, and as time passed, the transformation became more evident. The barracks no longer had the sharp divide between young recruits and the older veterans. There was a sense of camaraderie that had never existed before, a mutual understanding that the younger Marines had begun to develop. They had learned to value the veterans not just for their history, but for their wisdom, their resilience, and the lessons they carried with them. One afternoon, Captain Reynolds found himself walking across the tarmac with a group of young Marines. They were laughing and joking, but there was a different tone in their voices, one that acknowledged the veterans they passed. As they neared the hangar, Reynolds saw John Davis standing off to the side, as usual, observing the younger Marines as they went through their drills. He was quietly watching, his hands folded behind his back, a figure who seemed to blend into the background, but whose presence was undeniable. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about him," one of the Marines said quietly as they walked past. "I always thought he was just some old guy who fixed stuff. But after hearing his stories, he's a legend." The others nodded in agreement. It was clear that their view of the old veteran had changed. Reynolds didn't say anything at first, but as they continued walking, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Pride in the Marines who had taken the time to listen, to learn, and to respect the past. He had played a role in that shift, in helping them see that respect was earned not by rank, but by what one did and who one was. As they neared Davis, the group fell into a comfortable silence. The old man turned, sensing their presence before they spoke. His eyes met Reynolds, and the captain gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "Sir," Reynolds said, his voice steady and filled with the respect he had now come to fully understand. "The men are learning. They're beginning to see what you've been teaching all along." Davis simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the years of service and sacrifice that had shaped him into the man he was. "It's about time," he said with a slight smile, but his voice was laced with the kind of calm assurance that only comes with experience. "You can only lead by example, Captain. The rest will follow when the time is right." Reynolds stood still for a moment, taking in the old man's words. "I've learned that," he replied, "and I think the rest of them have too." The younger Marines, now standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of the moment. One of them, a young private who had joined the unit just a few months prior, stepped forward. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you," he said, looking at Davis. "For everything you've done, for all the stories and everything you've taught us." The words were simple, but they held a sincerity that struck a chord. Davis didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at the young private, his eyes softening. "You'll learn more from the stories than you will from any textbook," he said quietly. "But the most important thing you'll learn is this. Never forget the sacrifices that were made to get you here, and never stop earning the respect of those who came before you." The young private nodded, his expression serious. The group stood in silence for a few moments, each person reflecting on the weight of the words they had just heard. It wasn't just about following orders or fulfilling duties. It was about honoring the past, respecting the present, and carrying forward the lessons learned from both. As the group slowly dispersed, Reynolds stayed behind for a moment, looking at Davis. "You've made a real difference here," Reynolds said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "More than you realize." Davis met his gaze, his face unchanged, but his eyes betrayed the slightest hint of a smile. "I didn't do it for recognition, Captain," he replied. "I did it because I knew it was the right thing to do. And if the next generation learns even half of what they need to, then I've done my job." Reynolds stood silently for a moment, knowing that the true power of what Davis had done wasn't in the stories he told or the lessons he imparted. It was in the way he lived his life, quietly, humbly, and with the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. And for the first time, Reynolds fully understood what it meant to lead by example, not by authority. It wasn't just about being in charge. It was about earning trust, being someone worth following, and never losing sight of what really mattered. Weeks passed, and the atmosphere at the base continued to shift. The veterans who had once been sidelined were now integral parts of the everyday routine. John Davis, despite his quiet nature, had become somewhat of a symbol, a reminder of the humility, strength, and history that was often overlooked. Captain Reynolds found himself drawn to him more often, seeking not only his wisdom, but also a sense of guidance he had never known he needed. He had learned that leadership was more than just giving orders. It was about living with integrity, about showing the men and women under your command what it meant to lead by example. One afternoon, as Reynolds was going over some reports in his office, he felt a light tap on the doorframe. Looking up, he saw Davis standing there, a slight smile on his face. "Got a minute, Captain?" Davis asked, his voice calm and steady. Reynolds motioned for him to come in. "Of course, sir. What's on your mind?" Davis stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. He didn't sit, as was his way, but instead stood by the window, looking out over the tarmac. "You've come a long way," Davis said, his gaze never leaving the window. "You've changed more than you realize." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. "I think I'm just starting to understand what it really means to be in charge, to be a leader." Davis chuckled softly, his voice rich with experience. "It's not just about telling people what to do, Captain. It's about showing them, helping them grow." Reynolds nodded slowly, the weight of the words sinking in. "I think I've been trying too hard to prove myself," he said quietly. "I thought respect came from power, from being in control. But now, I see it's about trust, about being there for the people around you." Davis turned from the window, his eyes meeting Reynolds with a knowing look. "You've got it now," he said. "That's the most important thing. The power isn't in the rank or the uniform. It's in the people you lead. And they'll follow you if they trust you." Reynolds stood up, moving to stand next to Davis at the window. "I'm still learning," he said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "But I know this. I want to be the kind of leader who earns trust, not demands it." Davis gave him a small nod, a look of approval in his eyes. "You're getting there, Captain. Just remember, it's a journey. You'll make mistakes, you'll stumble. But as long as you keep learning, you'll keep earning that trust." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the young Marines as they trained outside. They were the next generation, the ones who would carry the torch forward. And in that quiet moment, Reynolds realized that his role as a leader wasn't just about preparing them for battle. It was about preparing them for life. "I'll keep working at it," Reynolds said softly. "I won't let them down." Davis turned to him, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You never will," he said. "Just remember, lead with your heart, not just your head." With that, Davis turned and left the room, leaving Reynolds to reflect on the depth of the conversation. He was beginning to understand, more than ever, that leadership wasn't a title, it was a responsibility. It was something you earned every day, with every decision, with every action. And as he stood there, watching the Marines outside, he knew that he was ready to take on that responsibility, not because of his rank, but because of the lessons he had learned from men like John Davis. It wasn't about being the best in the room. It was about helping those around you be the best they could be. The days seemed to blur together as Captain Reynolds settled into his new understanding of leadership. The respect he had gained, not through his rank, but through his actions, was beginning to shape the way he interacted with the men under his command. He no longer saw them as subordinates, but as partners, each of them contributing their unique skills to the mission at hand. The young Marines were growing, maturing, and it was clear that they respected him, not just because of his position, but because they knew he had earned it. One morning, as Reynolds walked through the training grounds, he spotted John Davis off to the side, watching the new recruits work. Davis had become somewhat of a mentor to the younger soldiers, a figure they could look to for guidance and wisdom. He had never sought the role, but it had found him, just as the respect of the men who had once dismissed him had found its place in the barracks. Reynolds approached, feeling a sense of gratitude for the old man who had taught him more than any academy or officer school ever could. "Sir," Reynolds greeted, his voice steady. "How's it going today?" Davis looked up from the field, his expression unchanged. "Same as always, Captain," he replied, his voice calm and measured. "Just making sure they're doing it right." Reynolds chuckled, the humor not lost on him. "I've been meaning to ask," he began. "How did you do it? How did you make such an impact on all of us? You didn't say much, but somehow, you've got everyone listening." Davis paused, as if considering the question carefully. "You want the truth, Captain?" he asked, his eyes meeting Reynolds with a knowing look. "It's not about what you say. It's about what you do. People don't follow words. They follow actions. And if you're consistent with those actions, they'll follow you anywhere." The words hit Reynolds with the same weight they had the first time he had heard them. It wasn't about trying to impress or prove a point. It was about living a life that showed, not told, what you stood for. "I get it now," Reynolds said, his voice softening with understanding. "It's about leading by example, isn't it?" Davis nodded, his gaze turning back to the young Marines as they drilled. "That's right," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "And when they see you making the hard decisions, when they see you not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, that's when they know you're someone worth following." Reynolds took a moment to watch the recruits, noticing the way they looked to Davis for guidance, how they respected him without question. It wasn't just because of his past. It was because of how he carried himself in the present. "I think I've got a long way to go," Reynolds admitted, his voice carrying the weight of the realization. "But I'm getting there." Davis turned to him then, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You've come a long way, Captain. The fact that you're asking questions like this means you're already on the right path." As they stood there together, watching the younger Marines work, Reynolds felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. What mattered was leading with integrity, with respect, and with the kind of humility that could only come from knowing how much you still had to learn. The path ahead was still long, but now, Reynolds understood what it meant to truly lead. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most powerful. It was about being the one who could guide others through their own journey, helping them find their way by showing them how to walk the path themselves. And in that quiet moment, as he stood beside John Davis, Reynolds knew that he was finally ready to be the leader they all needed. Not because of his rank, but because he had earned their trust, and that was worth more than any title could ever give him. As the weeks passed, Captain Reynolds found himself spending more time reflecting on the lessons he had learned from John Davis. His approach to leadership had shifted significantly, and the changes were evident not only in how he interacted with the men under his command, but also in the way they responded to him. It was subtle at first, small shifts in how the younger Marines looked to him for guidance, how they spoke to him with respect, not because of his rank, but because they had come to trust his judgment. The barracks were quieter these days, not in the sense of silence, but in the sense that the noise of arrogance and competition had been replaced by a more genuine sense of camaraderie. Captain Reynolds now found himself at ease in his role. He no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The constant drive to impress, to be the best, had given way to a desire to help his fellow Marines become the best versions of themselves. It wasn't easy, and there were days when doubts still crept into his mind. But the more he embraced the lessons of humility, the more the men responded. He had stopped seeing himself as someone who needed to lead from the front at all times. Instead, he saw himself as a guide, someone who helped his Marines find their own path. One afternoon, as Reynolds stood by the range watching the new recruits fire their weapons, John Davis approached. The old man, still carrying the weight of years of service, stood next to him silently, watching the recruits with a keen eye. "They're doing better," Davis said, his voice steady. "You're doing well, Captain." Reynolds turned to look at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You've stopped leading with your ego," Davis replied. "That's a big step for any officer. You're letting them learn, letting them grow. That's what real leadership is. Reynolds nodded slowly, taking in the words. I've been thinking about that a lot, he said quietly. I think it's easier for me now to see them as individuals. I used to see them as just soldiers, but now I realize they're people. I need to help them become the best they can be, not just in battle, but in life. Davis gave a small smile, his eyes twinkling with the faintest hint of pride. That's the right way to think, Captain. It's not just about making them good soldiers. It's about making them better men. The two stood there for a while, watching the recruits as they took their shots, the sound of gunfire ringing out in the distance. It was in these quiet moments that Reynolds realized how far he had come, not just as a leader, but as a person. He wasn't the same man who had walked onto this base months ago, eager to prove himself. He had learned that leadership wasn't about shouting orders or seeking validation. It was about guiding others, giving them the space to grow, and trusting them to rise to the occasion. As the day wore on, Reynolds and Davis spoke about life after service, about the challenges of moving on from a life that had been defined by duty and sacrifice. Davis, who had long since made peace with his past, spoke with the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through the hardest moments and come out the other side stronger. It's not about what you do, Davis said, his voice thoughtful. It's about who you are when you're doing it. It's about the integrity you carry with you every step of the way. Reynolds thought about that for a long time, letting the words sink in. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about doing it for the right reasons. And as he stood there, side by side with a man who had seen it all, he realized that his journey was only just beginning. There was so much more to learn, so much more to give. But now, he understood that the real strength of a leader wasn't in his rank or his experience. It was in his ability to connect with others, to lift them up, and to help them become the best version of themselves. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the range, Reynolds felt a sense of peace. He knew that, whatever the future held, he was ready. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had finally learned how to ask the right questions and how to listen to those who had been there before him. Months had passed since Captain Reynolds had learned the lessons that reshaped his leadership style, but the changes didn't stop there. The impact of his transformation rippled throughout the base, with every day becoming a new opportunity for him to embody the principles of respect, humility, and genuine leadership he had once struggled to grasp. He had learned to lead not by power, but by example. The Marines under his command were not just soldiers. They were individuals with their own strengths, weaknesses, dreams, and fears. He had learned to see them for who they were and help them grow into the best versions of themselves. One day, as Reynolds was walking across the tarmac, he saw a familiar figure standing off to the side of the field, watching the new recruits. John Davis, despite his age and the years of service behind him, was still present, still quietly guiding the next generation. He didn't seek recognition, but his presence was undeniable. He had earned the right to stand there, to observe, and to teach in his own way. Reynolds approached him slowly, a sense of gratitude settling in his chest as he got closer. Sir, he greeted Davis, his voice filled with genuine respect. I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, for all the lessons. I'm still learning, but I think I'm getting it now. Davis didn't look up at first, his eyes still focused on the recruits as they went through their drills. You're getting there, Davis said quietly, his voice steady. But it's not about getting it all at once. It's about understanding that it's a constant process. Leadership isn't a destination. It's a journey. Reynolds nodded, absorbing the weight of the words. I used to think I had to be perfect, that I had to have all the answers. But now I know it's about being real with them. It's about being present, being consistent. Davis finally turned to face him, his eyes sharp but kind. You've learned the hardest lesson, Captain. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there when they need you, and you have to give them a reason to trust you. That's what makes a good leader. The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching the recruits as they continued their drills. There was a deep sense of peace in that silence, a quiet understanding between them that didn't need words to be understood. Reynolds had come a long way since that first encounter with Davis. He had gone from a man eager to prove himself to someone who understood that true leadership wasn't about authority or power. It was about earning trust and respect. It was about giving others the tools they needed to succeed and supporting them when they stumbled. I used to think it was all about the rank, Reynolds said softly, almost to himself. But now I see it's about who you are when no one's looking. It's about what you do when there's no one to impress. Davis nodded, his gaze shifting back to the recruits. That's right, he said. And when you do that, when you lead by example, they'll follow you. Not because they have to, but because they want to. The words sank in deep. Reynolds had heard them before, but now, they held more meaning than ever. He had been given a gift, the gift of perspective, and he wasn't going to waste it. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the training grounds, Reynolds felt a sense of peace wash over him. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be. But he had learned something far more valuable. Leadership wasn't about being flawless. It was about being authentic, being present, and doing the right thing, even when it wasn't the easy thing. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Davis, who was still watching the recruits with the same quiet intensity. There was no need for recognition, no need for applause. Davis had earned his place through his actions, and that, Reynolds realized, was the truest form of leadership. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career. It wasn't about titles or ranks. It was about making a difference in the lives of those you led. And that was what he would strive to do every single day. As the months turned into a year, Captain Reynolds had settled into his role as a leader in a way that felt more natural than ever before. His Marines, once skeptical of his leadership, now respected him not for his rank or the uniform he wore, but for the way he had evolved, how he had learned, how he had grown, and how he had shown them what it meant to lead with integrity. He spent his days working alongside them, guiding them not through commands, but through shared experiences. The base had become a place of unity, not division. The camaraderie that had once been absent now ran deep. It wasn't just about the missions anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about the bonds they shared, the respect they had earned from one another, and the understanding that they were all in this together. One morning, as Reynolds walked through the barracks, he was met with the familiar faces of his team. They greeted him with genuine smiles, and though there was no formal acknowledgement of how things had changed, it was clear to him that they understood. The respect he had earned was no longer something he had to ask for. It had become a part of who he was. As he walked toward the training grounds, his mind drifted back to the first time he had met John Davis. The old man had been a quiet presence then, but Reynolds had seen the depth behind his eyes, the wisdom he carried, and the lessons he had to offer. Now, looking back, Reynolds realized how much he had learned from him, how much he had learned from all the veterans who had quietly shaped his understanding of what it meant to serve. The day was warm, the kind of day that felt like a new beginning, and as Reynolds arrived at the training field, he saw Davis standing off to the side, watching the recruits as they practiced their drills. As always, Davis was calm, observant, never rushing to give advice unless it was asked for. Reynolds approached him, his footsteps quiet on the ground. "You know, I've been thinking a lot," Reynolds began, stopping beside him. "I've come a long way, but I wouldn't have gotten here without the lessons I learned from you and the others." Davis glanced at him briefly, then back at the recruits. "You've learned more than you think, Captain," Davis replied softly. "And you've still got a long way to go." Reynolds chuckled. "I know, but I think I'm finally starting to understand that leadership is about more than just being in charge." "It always was," Davis said with a smile. "It's about leading with your heart. People follow you when they trust you, when they see you as someone who cares about them, not just the mission." The simplicity of the words struck Reynolds deeply. It wasn't about trying to be perfect. It wasn't about commanding every room he walked into. It was about creating an environment where his Marines felt valued, where they felt like they mattered. "I get that now," Reynolds said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I've been so focused on the mission, on the next step, on proving myself. But I see now that the real work is in the people I'm leading." Davis gave a slight nod, his eyes still focused on the young Marines as they practiced. "That's the heart of it, Captain. The mission will always be there. But the people? They're what make it worth it." Reynolds stood in silence beside him for a while, reflecting on the truth in Davis's words. He looked out at the recruits, who were now taking a break, laughing with one another and enjoying the camaraderie that had become so familiar to him. This was what it was all about. It was about the people, the ones who would carry on the legacy of those who came before them. "I'll keep doing my best," Reynolds said finally. "To lead with heart, like you said." Davis smiled, a rare but genuine expression of pride on his face. "I know you will, Captain. You've got it in you." With that, the two men stood there together, watching the next generation of Marines. The work wasn't easy, and the road ahead would be long. But Reynolds knew, without a doubt, that he was on the right path. Not because of the rank on his chest, but because of the respect he had earned, not just from his Marines, but from the legacy of those who had taught him the true meaning of leadership.